Thank you, Mike. Thank you. I mean, I think for those of us on the far left in the United States who are advocates against war, imperialism, and foreign military intervention, watching the last presidential campaign reinforced our detachment from the Republican-Democratic conflict of the United States. I mean, if you watched the whole debate and the reaction of the foreign policy establishment to the rise of Donald Trump, you saw that the war apparatus of the Democrats and the Republicans were very much united against the entrance into the United States political system of somebody who does not come from a political background and who was not initially sounding off on the same war agenda of his competitor, Hillary Clinton, who was the official war candidate in the last election. I mean, it was quite interesting to see the foreign policy establishment, the columnists, the DC think tank, the human rights merchants of Washington, DC, and many others, united in their endorsement of Hillary Clinton. And they were only alarmed about the possibility that somebody who may not perpetuate the unending war agenda, which really escalated after September 11, but it started far earlier than that, especially in the first Gulf War of 1991, they were very alarmed that there could be a disruption in the war agenda. And I think very much, if you look at the media today, and I am very pleased with US mainstream media today in their blatant biases, because there are no qualms anymore about where they stand. And the social media activity of mainstream journalists is a pleasure to watch. We don't anymore have to document the biases of New York Times correspondents and columnists of the Washington Post and so on, because it's out there now. Nobody is making any pretension. And what is interesting in the case of Donald Trump, in that early on in his campaign, he expressed opinions that deviated from the war agenda on several fronts. I mean, he comes from the East Coast wealthy establishment Republican Party type, who used to be associated with the isolationism, and of course isolationism with limitations because it never applied to Latin America and the hemisphere. Donald Trump at first, for example, expressed his view that the US should be neutral towards Arab-Israeli conflict. I mean, he said that in the first few debates, and there was such an uproar, and there was such a strong reaction that he very quickly retracted, and his own son-in-law had to write opinion pieces in American press in order to underline the AIPAC lobby that is still being preserved and that he will not deviate from embracing the AIPAC agenda. The second thing is he was in favor of withdrawing US troops from the Middle East region. He was against the war in Iraq. He was against US troops being involved in Syria in support of Syrian rebels. And he was against the intervention in Libya, and he even called for withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. So we'll see what happened to that one. He also was one of the most vociferous critics of Saudi Arabia in the contemporary history of any candidate we've seen. He used to mock and ridicule in the Saudi royal family, and he used to say, rightly so, that if it wasn't for US military protection, direct military protection, that the Saudi royal family would not have survived. And we saw, however, that very quickly Trump changed his views on many of these issues. So after 2 years of Trump being in power, we can now evaluate his tenure to see the extent to which, when we live under an empire, it doesn't matter who the president is, especially because they come from the two parties. There's no surprises like in European democracies where there are much more political parties running for office. So in the case of Trump, we find he even contradicted himself by virtue of the pressure of the war apparatus. And I think that we now know that the military intelligence apparatus of the United States is willing to pressure a president to go along its own lines by virtue of the leaks that are coming out. I have never seen a president facing the avalanche of leaks that are coming out largely from the intelligence community, the CIA and others, in order to put pressure on the president to make him much weaker and much more subject to their own pressures. They used to say about J. Edgar Hoover that he was able to have dirt on each president, and by virtue of that, they were not able to fire him, and they will do his own things. We see much more of that now. And we've seen that Trump has reversed himself on many of the key issues that he said he would not do. On the issue of troops, for example, he is now still involved in Libya. U.S. armed forces are bombing Libya as we speak, as well as bombing Somalia. And the thing is about the United States is that there are so many wars that we don't hear about. These are wars that are not important for U.S. mainstream media to cover. And these are wars that the U.S. mainstream media want us to believe that they do not exist anymore. The bombing of Somalia, the U.S. military role in Mali, the U.S. war in Libya, the U.S.-Israeli war in Egypt, along with the Egyptian dictatorship. And Donald Trump has increased U.S. troops in Syria. He's also increasing troops in Iraq. And against his own wishes, that's what we're told, he agreed to the demand by the U.S. military command to send more troops to Afghanistan. So we find that a man who originally wanted a more isolationist role by the United States has endorsed the war agenda. This reminds me about the French president François Mitterrand, who, when he assumed office, and he was the first socialist president in the Fifth Republic in France, and when he assumed power several years later was asked, what are some of the biggest surprises he faced? And he famously said that one of the surprises to me was that I realized how little you can do as president. Because there is such, that's the modern definition of capitalism. The system is so well entrenched, it matters much less than voters think when you change from one party to another party, even if the change is from conservative to socialist, which is the case in France, which is not the case of the United States. So he changed his views on the question of increasing troops. He changed his views on the relationship with Gulf regimes. He established a very simple formula with Gulf regimes. And one of the things that's been offending me the most in the last few weeks is the sense of sanctimoniousness that is being expressed by the Obama administration functionaries on social media. These people have no shame whatsoever. They are out there criticizing Trump for disregarding human rights in his relationship with the dictatorship of Saudi Arabia. When was it different? When was that different under any U.S. president? Saudi Arabia has been cuddled, enabled, sponsored, armed, protected by every president since FDR without interruption, including the self-declared human rights president of Jimmy Carter. Saudi Arabia never suffered from any repercussion for its oppression and murders by any U.S. president. Obama was no exception. You can Google his picture bowing down, literally, to the King of Saudi Arabia in his first year in office. Trump, of course, no exception. Trump, however, has made it very explicitly the transactional relationship that it is. We want the proceeds from oil. In return, we protect you, and we look the other way, as we have done for all your human rights violation. This is not a new formula. Trump is only explicit in how he expresses it. Of course, previous presidents have to hide the real agenda of the relationship behind slogans about common interest and fighting terrorism and so on and so forth. This is about a kingdom that was the official sponsor of bin Laden, along with the US government, of course, in the 1980s. In return for his close relationship with Saudi Arabia, I remember that Saudi Arabia was the first country he ever visited. He wanted more money. And as a result, as you remember, Saudi Arabia announced arms purchases worth of $110 billion. Of course, Trump is soon going to realize that Saudis always make pledges for purchases and for grants and aid to other countries that they never keep. And the $110 billion, by the way, is a cooked figure that goes all the way from the Trump administration about arms purchases they've made before, as well as arms purchases they plan or consider making in the future. So the United States is not going to get that money. And I think Trump now has the opportunity, given what's going on, to ask for more money than $110 billion. And forgotten from the rhetoric of Trump is his previous mockery and ridicule of Saudi Arabian leaders, princes, and so on and so forth. The other issue that he's changed his views of course, is about the Arab-Israeli question. The man who in the past used to call, not in the distant past, in the first presidential debates, the first 5 or 6 of them, when he used to call for neutrality of the United States in Arab-Israeli conflict, which is something we last heard, I would say probably in the speeches by Richard Nixon when he was not in office in the 1960s, before he ran in 1968. So this is something that we don't hear anymore. Republican candidates used to say it mutely in the 1960s, but not anymore. So Trump said that, and yet he has become more pro-Israeli or as pro-Israeli as Obama. I mean, I've always argued that every US president is more pro-Israeli than his predecessor, probably with the possible exception of George Herbert Walker Bush. They have their own disputes, the loan guarantees, $10 billion to Israel, which he made tied to not building settlement in the West Bank. With that one exception, we can safely say every US president has been more pro-Israel than the predecessor. Do not forget the record of Obama of signing on more than $30 billion gift to the state of Israel for the next 10 years. In fact, if you read the lousy book by Ben Rhodes, who is the foreign policy advisor to Barack Obama, little difference in my mind, you will find in that book he admits that the advisors to Obama were counseling him even not to use the word occupation, which is something that Steve Bannon was calling for. So little difference when it comes to foreign policy between Trump, Obama, Bush, Clinton, all the rest. The other thing that Trump changed in relationship to the world, of course, is that the war state, the war apparatus of the state wanted a continuation of hostility towards China, Russia, and Korea. And for that reason, there is clear effort to sabotage any attempt to improve relationship with those countries. So what we find now in Trump's relationship in the Middle East is that continuation of American support for Israel, relocation of the embassy, and remember, the relocation of the embassy should be blamed on Democrats and Republicans who voted in favor back in the 1990s, and this has law been on the book since. And every candidate for president has promised to relocate it. Trump implemented that promise. And as you know, I mean, as far as the Palestinian rights are concerned, I mean, the move of the embassy was really less significant than it sounds, because the former embassy was located in Tel Aviv, which really is occupied Jaffa. So the American embassy was moved from one occupied part of Palestine to another occupied part of Palestine. We should be as alarmed about the occupation of Palestine in 1948 as we are about the occupation of Palestine of 1967. The notion by American liberals and others that we should make a distinction to pretend that Palestine was only occupied in 1967 when the area occupied was a mere 23% of the whole of Palestine is an attempt to erase history, to erase a legacy of massacres and war crimes by the State of Israel since its inception, or even prior, when you count the record of terrorism by that state against Arabs, when Zionist gangs were roaming Palestine, and they introduced some weapons of terrorism for the first time ever in the Middle East region in the 1930s. It was don't take my word for it, even read Zionist historians like Walter Lecker in his book, A History of Zionism. In that book, he chronicles the truth, which is, in the 1930s, Zionists introduced the menace of terrorism to our region. What we're talking about, forms of violence that we've never seen before, but we've heard of since. We are talking about throwing grenades in crowded markets, booby-trapped ambulances, booby-trapped cars and trucks, shooting at civilians. You've heard about barrel bombs. They were used for the occupation of Jaffa, what is called today Tel Aviv. The Zionists were able to conquer it in the most methodical, terrorist way through rolling barrel bombs against the civilian population of Jaffa. Bombs on buses, bombs on trains, letter bombs to embassies, all that was introduced for the first time to our region long before ISIS, long before Al-Qaeda. So basically, Al-Qaeda, Bin Laden, ISIS, Baghdadi, and those types should really pay homage to the pioneers of the weapons that they have been using, and that would be Zionist gangs and the State of Israel later. On the issues of wars in the Middle East, Donald Trump has been going along with the war apparatus as they wish. They do not want to withdraw US troops in Syria, and the record in Syria has been one of terrible human rights violation. I mean, you find that Western human rights organization and Western correspondents and DC think tank types often talk about the innocent civilians being killed by Russian bombs, by Syrian regime bombs, and of course we should be appalled at bombs being thrown at civilians by any party, whether it's on the Iranian Syrian regime side or the American, Saudi, Qatari, Turkish, Syrian rebel side. But we don't hear about the record of American bombing of civilians. I mean, what happened in Raqqa is one of the worst chapters of the war in Syria, and yet it has received the least attention because these were US bombs. This is the way US fought its way in Syria, and yet all those Western correspondents who championed Syrian rebels, all types of Syrian rebels, and those who pretended to care about the Syrian civilians when they never shed a tear over the plight of Palestinian civilians, never protested at US war record in Raqqa and other places with US bombs. And when you talk about ISIS, because recently Trump and the US administration has been taking credit for the defeat and the retraction of ISIS areas in Syria and Iraq. In reality, I would say that the US had the least to do when it came to fighting ISIS in Syria and Iraq. In fact, truth to be told, foes of the United States did much more against ISIS in Syria and Iraq and Lebanon than the US and its allies and the Syrian rebels. But that's something, of course, would not get any recognition here in the United States. Our relationship with the Saudi regime is as good as it has ever been, and the United States is getting what it wants. And one of the things we see in the Middle East is that Gulf despots, Qatar and Saudi Arabia and UAE, they are all competing for influence, and they are all trying to ingratiate themselves with the US administration. And the way they go about that is in two ways. One, by buying weapons from the United States. It pleases Donald Trump, as it pleased previous US president. And two, by investing heavily in the United States market. And the second way they can ingratiate themselves with the United States administration is by agreeing with the Israeli lobby or pleasing the Israeli lobby and aligning themselves with the Israeli lobby. So we find today that the sides to the conflict in the Gulf, Qatar on the one hand, UAE and Saudi Arabia on the other hand, are equally trying to please the agenda of the Israeli lobby in Congress and in the media. For that reason, the Qatari government recorded for many months, with the work of great investigative reporters, a documentary in several parts about the clout of the Israeli lobby in American politics, and the Qatari government killed it. They would not air it for fear of upsetting the Israeli lobby. That's how the situation is. I would say that United States today under Trump is really little different from it was under Obama. And you can tick them off. United States remains supportive of the state of Israel and whatever it wishes to do against Palestinians. The United States remained totally indifferent to the plight of Palestinians being killed on weekly basis by the Israelis. 3, United States does not in any way put human rights as an issue in its foreign policy, not against one single country. Well, to be fair, the United States does care about human rights among in countries that are not aligned with the United States. So the United States is in favor of human rights in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Syria, in Iran. But of course, it is not in favor of human rights in Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, Iraq, and all the countries most despots of the Middle East are on the side of the United States. So this is why the discourse of human rights, today I read a statement by one of the foreign policy type in Washington saying that it is appalling that Trump has abandoned human rights from its foreign policy. When was it on the agenda? You can Google images to see Jimmy Carter hailing the Shah of Iran. You can see images of Jimmy Carter hailing the Crown Prince Fahd of Saudi Arabia. These issues are still in public record. So that hasn't changed. That human rights is absolutely of no significance. More than that, I would argue 4, Trump administration has continued the pattern of US foreign policy by which the United States is opposed to democracy everywhere in the Middle East region. The United States works against democracy. Now you may say, but under the United States, people voted in Iraq. Well, not thanks to the United States. In fact, the US occupation in Iraq had a different agenda about what should happen in Iraq, the political constitution of Iraq. The United States wanted not election in Iraq, but caucuses. They wanted people to be handpicked by the US occupiers, and those handpicked, it's a form of the elitism of what the founding fathers had about the electoral college. The founding fathers, as you know, came up with the electoral college because they thought the people, and by that they meant poor whites, the people cannot be trusted with the affair of the selection of president. They wanted people of the elite like them, wealthy and large and highly educated. George Washington was the largest landowner in America when he died, and he owned slaves, as you know. So they wanted people like them. Similarly, in Iraq, the occupation wanted to handpick individuals who in turn would pick presidents, speaker, prime minister, and so on. It was the cleric who really is the supreme guide in Iraq today, and that is the legacy of American occupation. Iraq used to be, it was a dictatorship for sure, but so are all other Arab countries. And that's largely thanks to US effort, I should add. Iraq used to be a secular republic. Iraq in the 1960s and 70s was a model for state feminism. Women in Iraq were ahead of women in most Arab countries. All of that changed. Because of the US occupation, we find today that Iraq is now under the rule of a cleric, just very much like Iran. But in Iran, it is announced. In Iraq, it's not announced. The man who decides all the affairs is the cleric, and it was the cleric who vetoed the plan by the United States to have caucuses select who is going to be president, prime minister, and all that. The 5th element of the United States is to continue the Middle East as not only a market for US weapons, but a testing ground for US weapons. Just think about it. I read once, this is in the 1990s, 70% of Air Force students got their training over the lands of Iraq. Imagine, they are trained in the art of bombing Iraqis. Think about the training of US troops since the 1990s. Those troops are being trained in the art of bombing and shelling Arabs or Muslims in Afghanistan. Just as the Israeli occupation state, when they train their army, they create these mock villages that all look like Muslim villages. But of course, in Israel, they are blatant about their racism because they get away with it in the international press and they don't have to account for it. The United States now does something similar in the military. They have mock Arab villages, and of course Arabic and Persian are languages that are most in demand because they assume these are going to be the future war. So US troops are now being trained in the lands of the Middle East region, and I don't see any change in that. When Trump wanted to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, the military commanders did what they did under Obama. They leak to the press their displeasure, and of course the press and the think tank scene in Washington, D.C. raise a hue and cry, and they all criticize the president. How could anybody disagree with commanders of the U.S. military? I mean, we have reached a point in the war state since the 1990s when Democrats and Republicans believe that no civilian U.S. president should disagree with whatever military commanders want. I mean, which was not even the picture in the U.S. contemporary history. I mean, you remember that Truman fired General MacArthur. You remember that Carter fired General Singlaub because he made a statement about Korea. We don't have that anymore. So against the Constitution, the war state have transformed the chain of command whereby every elected US president now serves under the military commanders who decide the course of the war and the arenas of wars, largely in the Middle East region, of course. The United States, however, is now planning the deal of the century. They plan this huge plan whereby it's supposed to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. But make no mistake about it, there's nothing new about that. This has been attempted by every president who dreams of Nobel Prizes since Richard Nixon. They all wanted a plan. There was the Rogers Plan in 1970, and there were plans of Jimmy Carter. Ford had the shuttle diplomacy. I mean, it happened under US president, and it doesn't change. And what America calls the peace process really is nothing less than a camouflage of American support for Israeli occupation and aggression. It is basically a charade to pretend that there is a peace process going under which or behind which Israel can hide as it invades, massacres, occupies, bombs, and so on and so forth. So there's nothing new about that, but there is something new in this deal of the century. They are trying to bypass the Palestinians. They want to solve the Palestinian problem by ignoring the Palestinians. But that also was attempted. Remember in the 1970s and 80s, they used to be called it the Jordanian option. They wanted Jordan to speak on behalf of the Palestinians. Now their brilliant plan is, let's have the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia to speak on behalf of the Palestinians. But what happened recently is, even Saudi Arabia found that the Crown Prince has gone too far. The king, you probably have seen this in the last 2 months, made statement to the press that have been reiterated almost daily in the Saudi press to the effect that Saudi Arabia has not changed its policies, and now they are distancing itself from the promises that Mohammed bin Salman made to his good friend Jared Kushner in the White House regarding the deal of the century. So nothing is going to be done. And the thing is, look, the Palestinian question has been with us for a century. And all attempts to eradicate it, to bypass the Palestinian, to disregard the Palestinian have failed. I mean, there is no form of terrorism that the Israeli state has not tried and inflicted on the Palestinian people. And all that has failed. The Palestinians, to their credit, manage with every new generation to innovate new forms of struggle and to get around the increasing level of terrorism used by Israel and sponsored by the United States. I wanted to speak something about the recent issue in the news, and I will say a few words about that. If you want to ask about it, I can elaborate. The issue that we have been hearing about of the Saudi journalists is not the way it's being portrayed. The Washington Post is making this huge campaign, which to me is quite insincere, because you think about it, when did the Washington Post care about human rights for Arabs in the region ever? When did Washington Post ever care about violations of human rights in Saudi Arabia? Never was the case. Now, who is this Saudi journalist? His name is Jamal Khashoggi, and he spent a career serving the propaganda interest of the Saudi royal family. That's his record. Now, I understand the Washington Post is making him already as a liberal, courageous critic of oppression in Saudi Arabia. He never was. He never claimed he was. He has been in opposition for 1 lone year, and he's been doing it in exile. So throughout the decades, when courageous, real courageous Saudi men and women, journalists, human rights advocates, feminists, secularists, socialists, when they were fighting, this man said not a word. He was serving the propaganda of the interest. Some people say that he was a journalist or an editor. There is no journalism in Saudi Arabia. There is propaganda. He was a chief propagandist for the royal family. Of course, we are saying that while condemning the murders by the Saudi regime against him and against anybody else. But it is unfair to brave Saudis to make this man what he never was. To his very last day, he denied he was even a dissident. He denied he was even an opposition figure. He, to his last day, accepted the legitimacy of the Saudi royal family. To his last day. And we learn now that he has been sending messages to the royal family. He was in contact with the brother of the crown prince, who is the ambassador of Saudi Arabia in Washington, D.C. He also sent message to the crown prince, basically wanting to be his advisor. So this story is really much less about freedom of expression for this guy. It was more about a guy who did not bet on democracy in his life ever. He bet on the wrong princes. He served various princes. He fought with bin Laden in Afghanistan in the 1980s. There's a picture of him, which I posted, carrying a rifle during those days. He also served Prince Turki Al Faisal, who was chief of Saudi intelligence when Saudi intelligence and the CIA ran these fanatical anti-communist terrorists, really, in the 1980s. But we on the left have nothing to apologize for, because when Americans, liberals and conservative, were championing these fanatical Muslims in Afghanistan, we on the left were on the side of the communists. And that's something that we should be proud of. While they were with bin Laden, we on the left, we on the left in Lebanon and the Arab world were on the side of the communists who were fighting against bin Laden and his comrades. So this guy was very close to Saudi Turki bin Faisal, the head of chief intelligence. And later on, he chose another prince, Al-Walid bin Talal. So he moved between princes. But guess what? The princes that he served fell out of favor. So as a result, he was out of prince, out of place. And the prince, the new guy, didn't want him, didn't like him. So he left the country. And when he left the country in the last year, I have been watching him closely on social media and reading him in the Washington Post. And it's something striking to me, that what he wrote in English is different from what he wrote in Arabic. In Arabic, he was speaking an Islamist line, and he spoke passionately about Palestine. In the Washington Post, he never mentions Palestine. And I wonder if the pages of the Washington Post would have been opened for him if he was speaking the way he was speaking in Arabic, if he was speaking about Palestine, which he never did. But, so he had a career for 1 year. The Saudi royal family, for whatever reason, signed to get rid of him. And they killed him. But this is not new for the Saudi royal family. Their record of cruelty goes many decades in the past. In 1979, there was a really courageous Saudi journalist writer, and he was a labor leader. His name is Nasser al-Said. And it is sad to me that you, among others, have heard of Jamal Khashoggi, but not the brave Nasser al-Said. Nasser al-Said was a secular, feminist, socialist, and he was a thorn in the side of the royal family. And to make things worse for the royal family, he published a massive history of the Saudi royal family. I mean, it's not really a scientific book, and it's not really reliable in many of the stuff it contains, many tabloidish, but that book became a bestseller. It has no publishing house. It's still available for free on the internet in Arabic. And yet, it became a hit. Saudi royal family wanted to get rid of the guy. So what they did is, they hired one of the most corrupt lieutenants of Yasser Arafat in Beirut, and that guy kidnapped him, put him in the trunk of a car, and delivered him to the Saudi royal family. We don't know what they did to him, but most likely he was tortured and killed. Rumors are that they threw his body from a plane over the desert of the empty quarter in Saudi Arabia. So for people who watch Saudi Arabia over the years, we know the record of violation. And do not have high hopes that the US, Democrats or Republican, in Congress and outside, are going to wake up to the oppression of Saudi Arabia and break with it. This will pass, just as previous crises with Saudi Arabia passed. Remember the movie Death of the Princess, when the Saudi royal family beheaded a couple because they fell in love? Well, it was soon forgotten by Britain and by the United States and other countries. The same will happen. Don't hold your breath. Thank you for listening. Yes, please.
Well, first I'd like to thank you for the thoughtful and comprehensive analysis of the Middle East. May I let the mics I was saying I would just like to thank you for the really thoughtful and comprehensive analysis. I'd like to hear your opinion on what's going on in the northern region of Syria with the in the Kurdish majority areas. If you could give a brief evaluation of what's going on there and the prospects of those rebels.
Well, I mean, as you know, they are working on behalf of the United States. And when you work on behalf of the United States, you do not have an independent agenda. The United States is not going to arm and fund progressive communists or leftists of any type. And the United States, when they arm and finance a group, a militia in that particular case, they are not going to allow it to dictate the agenda to the United States. So for that reason, I resent the fact that this militia, which initially spoke on behalf of legitimate Kurdish aspirations in Syria and beyond, wound up being a tool in the hands of the United States, being used for purely US agenda. And unfortunately, that's the case. And if Kurdish political groupings in the contemporary history of the Middle East, if they have learned any lesson, is that relying on Israel and the United States is the most fatal mistake ever imagined, because they will abandon you at the drop of a hat. And the Kurdish parties in Iraq have been abandoned repeatedly by the United States and by Israel. And now, Kurdish political groupings in Iraq, in northern Iraq are at their weakest because they got so arrogant, they got so triumphalist, thinking that Israel and America would allow them to do whatever they want, to rule and to declare independence. And guess what? When the other militias fought against them and defeated them and humiliated them, nobody came to their rescue. And I worry something similar is going to happen in Syria. The United States is going to abandon them, and then they will be at the mercy of the regime yet again. Yes, please.
I have a question. Thank you for the talk, first of all. Second, I've always imagined the American imperial triangle between Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the States to maintain its own imperial projects in the Middle East, including a settler colonial state in...
Including what?
A settler colonial state in Israel. Yeah. I was wondering if a country like Egypt, which is not mentioned as much when it comes to American interests in the region, is it as relevant as it used to be? For example,
Egypt?
Yeah. First of all, and second of all, I just want to elaborate. Want you to elaborate on the American policies when it comes to Egypt of arms sale, neoliberal impoverishing policies, crackdowns, and so on, and its relation to the actual material conditions of an average Egyptian of a country of 100 million people. So.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons why I have particularly bitter attitude to Jimmy Carter is he was behind the Camp David arrangement. One of the biggest services done to Israel by the US is the Camp David Accord. What he did was to basically bribe the corrupt military political leadership of Egypt, establish a dictatorship and protect a dictatorship in Egypt. In return, for a peace treaty with Israel and an insulation, total insulation of Egypt from any role in Arab-Israeli issues on the side of the Palestinians. You have to remember what Egypt used to be. When I was a kid, I was born in 1960. From 1952 until 1970, Egypt was on the forefront advocating on behalf of the Palestinians. We used to hear about the slogan of Nasser, became known in English, about a just and a comprehensive peace in the Middle East. What Nasser was meaning by that slogan is a refutation, a rejection of U.S. attempt. America always attempted to isolate all Arab countries and to try to reach separate peace treaty with individual Arab countries. And they tried that over the years. They tried with Jordan, with Lebanon, with Syria, and with Egypt. As you know, they signed a peace treaty with Egypt and with Jordan, and they signed one in Lebanon in 1982. But proudly, I can say it didn't last only for a few months. The Lebanese people revolted against it, supported by Palestinian resistance movement, and they forced the Lebanese parliament to rescind the signature and the ratification of that peace treaty. And of course, Lebanon now is so least imaginable country to ever sign a peace treaty with Israel. It's become a symbol of resistance to Israeli occupation and terrorism. Jimmy Carter basically established the modern Egyptian dictatorship. And he basically reached an agreement whereby, in return for Egyptian abandonment of the Palestinian cause, U.S. will fund and prop up and protect the Egyptian pro-American dictatorship and will create a very corrupt military intelligence class from which came the current dictator Sisi. And that's what's been going on. I mean, there was a brief interruption in that when the Egyptian people rose up in the uprising of January of 2011. But America quickly adjusted. America, Qatar, Saudi Arabia all led the counter-revolution to bring things back the way they were. And even when the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a corrupt organization which raises slogan that it does not mean on the Palestinian question, proved to be as loyal and subservient to Western interests as the dictatorship that it fought against. In fact, we know this now. Tunisian Muslim Brotherhood, Nahda Party, and Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood came to Washington, D.C., and they paid homage to AIPAC, and they spoke before WINIP, Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and they made pledges, basically, to abandon, because they used to say they're against peace treaty with Israel, and the Tunisian version, they used to say they are in favor of what the Tunisian people demand, which is criminalization of normalization with Israel. But they made pledges to the reverse in America and Washington. In return, John McCain and others supported them and supported them in power. And under that arrangement, America was able to live with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt just as they have been able to live with the Muslim Brotherhood in Tunisia. They are not troublesome. They never were. And Hamas now is going the same route of Fatah with accommodation and settlement with the state of Israel without gaining any land. So the Egyptian state is not central because America doesn't allow it. America wants to isolate Arab countries. And of course, Sadat was able to achieve that by propagating a chauvinistic Egyptian identity, which was in contrast with the larger Arab identity that Nasser preached. I mean, Nasser had a much grander, broader definition of identity. As you know, in his book, Philosophy of Revolution, he spoke about the three circles. There was the African circle, there was the Muslim circle, and there was the Arab circles. All these circles were at play. Not anymore. Sadat, in return for American aid, wanted to isolate Egypt from the Arab world, and to a large degree that was achieved under a dictatorship. We saw when the Egyptian people were free for a brief period after the uprising of 2011, you know what's the first thing they did? They stormed the Israeli embassy and they set it on fire. They rejected the peace treaty with Israel. But that did not last. America put its foot down, and of course later they supported the current despot, Sisi. Yes, there was a hand here. Please. Yes. Yeah.
So thank you for the passionate and comprehensive talk, first of all.
Passionate. I was calm today.
If that's calm, well, can't imagine passionate. Anyway, so I have two questions. First of all, about the fate of Arab Springs, particularly in Egypt, as you put it. So what was the causes behind America favoring Sisi ultimately over the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood? And the second question is about, again, northern Syria. I understand that the Kurdish party there is completely corrupt and in the hands of the US right now.
Right.
But the alternative is either Assad or Turkish invasion or ISIS. And what would be a practical and coherent stance on that question? Thank you.
Thank you. On the first question, the United States, as you know, did not want the despot Mubarak to fall. If you go back to the period, this is all what you read by Obama officials, by the memoirs of John Kerry, by the book by Ben Rhodes, and the biography of Obama that's going to come out. All these books are going to be telling lies. They stood with Mubarak until he could no more stay in power. I mean, just like America stood with the Shah until he left the country. People will say, but didn't Obama call for the dictator of Tunisia to step down? He did, when his plane was out of range of Tunisian airspace. I'm not exaggerating. Only then Obama called on the Tunisian dictator to step down. Up to the last point, they were supporting him. In Egypt, the same thing happened. America stood by Mubarak, and you can go on YouTube and find statements about Mubarak by Joe Biden. Can you believe this guy is now the symbol of the American democratic opposition or resistance? Joe Biden. Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton said the Mubaraks are family. So they stood by Robert Gates, Secretary of Defense at the time, and so on. So there was a debate how long we stand by him. But Hillary Clinton, when she realized that we can no more stand by Mubarak, she came up with a solution. You remember her solution, right? She wanted the head of the secret police, Omar, what's his last name, Riyad? Omar Suleiman. She wanted Omar Suleiman to take... So imagine that somebody suggesting that Hitler should step down and Himmler should take charge. I mean, that's a good alternative to Hitler. That's her idea of change in Egypt. So basically, they only adjusted to changes that in the beginning were dictated spontaneously by the people of Egypt. But then they couldn't anymore. Things were moving fast, but immediately they were in close touch with the intelligence, military apparatus. They were fine with the Muslim Brotherhood president, by the way. They were really fine. But the Saudis and the UAE could not live with that. And they allowed them, the US, I mean, I'm sure it's more than allowing. I'm sure they supported the plan to replace the Muslim Brotherhood president with General Sisi, and that's what we have today. So the US was heavily involved in crushing democracy in Egypt and elsewhere. I'm 58 years old now. I cannot think of one time, one country in the Middle East where the US ever stood for democracy. Not one example. For anybody who tells you that Trump is abandoning US principles and so on. I mean, give me one example and I will argue with you. I'm sorry? Right. On the second question about the alternative, I mean, look, my views on Syria are unpopular with all sides. I mean, I am not happy with the regime, I'm not happy with the rebels, I'm not happy with Russian intervention, not happy with American intervention. But it seems to me it should be basic for us on the left that a militia that is in the lap of the United States is not going to be championing women's rights and socialism. You know? Maybe I'm naive. Yes, please.
You're not naive. I just wish, I wish we could tie down all of the anarchists in the Bay Area and have them listen to your presentation, because I actually went to a number of events where they were lauding the Kurds in northern Syria as an alternative, basically.
I mean, I've seen American correspondent in the Middle East cheering bin Laden's people. I mean, in fact, Ben Rhodes' book that I mentioned earlier, this is the chief foreign policy advisor to Obama. This guy, in his own book, admitted that he championed that America should not declare Al-Qaeda in Syria, the people behind September 11, that they are not terrorists.
Yeah. Well, look, but here's
go ahead. Sorry,
a question. No, that's all right. question, I got two actually, but the question is, isn't it true that when I hear you said that the Brotherhood was pro-Israel, but didn't they whack Sadat?
I'm sorry?
Didn't the Brotherhood assassinate Sadat?
No, in fact, an offshoot of the Brotherhood.
Okay, all
yeah.
right, all right.
The Brotherhood had a very complicated history, but I can easily tell you during the Cold War, they were part of the tool of US imperialism during the Cold War. During the Cold War, there were the socialists and the communists. We were on one side. This is even in my own lifetime, my youth. The Muslim Brotherhood were on the opposite side. And they were certainly indulged not only by Jordanian regime, but also by the Israeli occupation state, because they were safe. They never were active in resistance against the state of Israel.
All right.
Hamas was an exception, but even its practice of violence was never something that we on the Palestinian and Lebanese left admired, because they resorted to car bombs, indiscriminate bombing, and look where they are now.
Right.
They are now begging for a settlement with the state of Israel.
Right.
So Hamas failed in its form of military resistance, and it failed also in its own diplomatic struggle that's engaged in today. Very much like the past of Yasser Arafat. I used to always say that the future of Hamas can be predicted by the past of Yasser Arafat. The Muslim Brotherhood today, however, has totally abandoned the issue of Palestine, officially. This is not like the Muslim Brotherhood where they used to wax nostalgic about liberation of Palestine. They don't do that anymore. It's a different story.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, final question is, there's a lot of disorientation in this country by people who I think consider themselves some kind of leftist or socialist, and it goes like this, that the Arab Spring represented some kind of revolution in the Middle East, that in Syria, Assad repressed it, and out of this repression came a group calling itself the Free Syrian Army. And therefore, because the Free Syrian Army was the military arm of the Syrian revolution, that Americans should support the Free Syrian Army. My understanding, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't think I know everything here, is that actually the Free Syrian Army was not homogenous, that a part of the Free Syrian Army was the I want to call them counter-revolutionary, but how about Nuestra? Does that mean anything
What's that?
to you? Al-Nuestra? Say it? Al-Nusra, okay.
Right.
Help me out. Which was basically the Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda. And that while I understand people want to do good, it doesn't make any sense to me to support Al-Qaeda as the alternative, because for every dime that the Free Syrian Army got, Al-Nusra got 9 cents.
No doubt.
So explain, am I off base here? What's going on?
The issue of Syria is a very long issue that requires a lot of time that we do not have. I think I spoke about it last time I was here at length. But I will say this about Syria. There is no question that the Syrian people deserve better, much better than the Syrian regime on all grounds. Not only there are lack of political freedoms and so on, but also there is something that should concern us on the left, which is the guy in power, Bashar al-Assad, has championed a neoliberal economic agenda. And this is why he was very much to the pleasure of the West for the first few years of his time in power until 2005 with the assassination of Rafiq Hariri in Lebanon. He promoted so-called reform that enriched cronies of the regime, including his own cousin, and left the people of Syria, especially in rural areas, impoverished. So you can give a class analysis to the Syrian uprising, whereby many of the rural people who were suffered from a terrible drought in Syria, as well as lack of job opportunities in a service sector economy in the capital of Damascus and big cities, those people became the fuel of the Syrian uprising. But let me say the following. And of course, there is another reason why to be opposed to the Syrian regime, which is even on the question of occupied territories, the Syrian regime still has not liberated the Golan Heights occupied by Syria. I mean, look at Lebanon's record. By Israel, I'm sorry. Yeah, by Israel, I'm sorry. The Syrian regime never liberated those lands still. What is their agenda for that? Look at Lebanon. Volunteers from South Lebanon were able to humiliatingly kick Israel out of South Lebanon. Something like that should happen in Syria to me. It should be the agenda of any regime, but it's not the agenda of the Syrian regime, not of the father and not of the son. The other thing about the Syrian regime is they seem to have to relish particularly oppressing and arresting left-wingers. They really have a phobia of left-wing communist activists. And Syria has a history of healthy left-wing activism, communist, socialist. There are so many communist parties in Syria. And they arrest them. I mean, I mentioned the other day, like there's a communist leader, Abdulaziz al-Khair, still in jail. And they give no reason where he is, why they arrested them and so on. So they go after communist types, I think, because they know that they are most effective in opposition. And they know that you cannot label them as jihadi, religious type terrorists and so on. So for all these reasons, and not to mention, I come out of the Lebanese Civil War experience in 1976, when the Lebanese and Palestinian resistance movement, these are leftist groups largely, were about to take over all of Lebanon to establish a revolutionary republic. This was smashed by a conspiracy. The part of the conspiracy where Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syrian regime, Israel, America, Western countries, all of them came together to prevent that from happening. So people like me have a bitter pill from those days still. So by the time of the Arab uprising, the Syrian people had every reason to want a change in their life, to want something much better than what they have, to reject the notion of a republican dynasty that is being established, father and son. But as the Syrian people spontaneously were expressing themselves in protests and so on, at the same time I maintain, that's my own reading now, I maintain Israel, Western countries and Gulf countries were already preparing, and you can find documentation of that from 2005 in Time magazine. The Bush administration had plans for fomenting trouble in Syria. So there was a plan to have arms smuggled into Syria and so on to foment a rebellion, and they thought, just like Gaddafi and Mubarak, they will collapse quickly. Well, it didn't happen, because Bashar al-Assad, unlike Gaddafi and unlike Mubarak, had regional international alliances they can draw on, just as Syrian rebels drew on their own allies from outside, including Israel. Israel had a very big role. We are learning now how huge Israel's role has been in the Syrian war, in arming militias and sponsoring militias. And to this very day, in the Washington Post and New York Times, whenever they mention Israel, they say, Israel, which has remained largely outside of the Syrian conflict, this is when Israel admits it has bombed Syria more than 200 times. I mean, how many more times it should bomb before he said, okay, Israel is intervening in Syria? 200 more probably. So with all that intervention, there was a plan to bring down the regime. What happened is that conspiracy basically derailed the popular uprising, set it aside, and weakened it. And basically, it took the destiny of Syria out of Syrian hands. The Free Syrian Army, basically, we can talk about multiple gangs under that name, because the one that operates in rural Aleppo is different from the one in Hama, different from the one in Raqqa. I mean, different gangs. And if you go back to the earlier period, each unit or battalion is named after a benefactor. Like you have 10 of them named after Saudi princes. One of them named after a Lebanese billionaire. I mean, that's how corrupt that has been. And in fact, you can say that the corruption and the thuggery of the Free Syrian Army pushed more Syrian in the rebellion phase or side into the arms of Nusra and the other ISIS types and so on. But Free Syrian Army, of course, did fight side by side with Nusra and other types. But now it's really like almost non-existent except in name, and only to allow Westerners and Western journalists to pretend there are Democrat and moderate among Syrian rebels. I mean, in reality, look at what's happening in Hama, for example. In Idlib, in Idlib. Largely the biggest force is Al-Qaeda, Bin Laden type.
Was there a revolution? Would you call that a revolution?
No, I do not call anything that happened anywhere in the Arab world a revolution. For Karl Marx, a revolution is when you have a fundamental change in social power, economic power, what he means by economic powers. We haven't had that altered. The system of power hasn't been altered in any state. I think what we saw was a revolutionary fervor in the beginning, but that was smashed by force, by an intervention by Gulf government, Western government, led by the United States and the State of Israel. Yes, please.
Yeah, there are some things that are going on in the world that actually are changing the way things are continuing things as they are. Number one is that the USA is losing its hegemony internationally. The imperialist competition has weakened economically the USA. If you look at the statistics, among the first 10 banks in the largest banks in the world, only now the US has 2.
Right.
And 10 years ago, we would have never dreamed that within the first 10 automakers in the world, an American automaker would not be first. And I would have, now it's Toyota, Volkswagen, etc. And then the American companies come third, fourth, and so on. So, and also in terms of exports. So the USA has increased all this aggressiveness in the world, trying to undermine the power of emerging power of China, the European Union, and so on. I'm from Latin America, and more than ever, you see, Chinese investments, European investments in the country. In the American backyard. I want to say that. You mentioned something very interesting about, urban warfare. There is the expressions of American commanders that they say that the battles of the future will be in the cities. And actually, I got, a counter-urgency manual F324 from the United States Army and Marine Corps that establishes that the models of war, against insurgency were Fallujah, Najat, and Ramadi, which, there were big battles in urban centers. So the Middle East is a training ground. You're absolutely right. I was reading, I'm very interested in military affairs. And I was reading that the Israeli commandos train the Navy SEALs in matters of counterinsurgency, and at the same time they train American police, here in the cities. So they are like preparing themselves to combat, what they see threats in the urban cities, let alone, with a lot of possibility in the American cities that, the repression against minority groups sometimes result in, protests and marches and so on. So could you comment on that, on the role of the U.S. Armed Forces?
There's no question that there are now challenges to U.S. global hegemony, and the United States government is the first to concede that. I recommend that you all read the last year national security strategy of the United States, which was prepared by the former National Security Advisor, General McMaster, in which the United States specifically mentions that they will not allow China and Russia in particular to rise as they have been rising. But there's nothing they can do about it. But having said that, I don't want to minimize the global reach and bullying of the US around the world. The United States now is found in more than 800 military bases that are official and public. These are not the secret bases that we don't know about. The United States now's troops are available in 137 countries of the world. So the US is still there in a way that China and Russia is not. This is why it was very important for the United States to try to undermine Russian influence in Syria, for example. The Chinese are building it their own way, like Deng Xiaoping wanted it, very slowly, very quietly, and without any fanfare. You're right about their investment, infrastructure, broad lines throughout Africa and Latin America and countries of Asia, the Asian Development Bank. So they're clearly entering the picture in a big way. And in the next 10 years, it is estimated the Chinese economy is going to be the biggest share of the world economy ahead of the United States. And if you look at comparison figures, economic indicators, US and China, in the last 20, 30 years, it's stunning. And you're right, I saw the one about banks, the top banks around the world and so on. But a big power, an empire like the United States, doesn't go down gently. You know, it will go down kicking and screaming. And the US is kicking and screaming. I didn't know about Israelis training Navy SEALs. I have read about Israelis military, occupation military training American police forces. Maybe whenever we see cases of shooting of unarmed civilians here in the streets of America, we should remember that perhaps this is part of the lessons they learned from the Israelis. Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to me that as the U.S. is less able to bully other countries economically, it might get more aggressive militarily, which is its remaining strength, and it worries me. And you did touch briefly in passing on how the liberal press likes to beat Trump up for making nice with official enemies or cozying up to the Russians or whatever, and it always
or
seems,
North Korea.
or North Korea.
Yeah, they wanted
always
war.
Seems like you know, well, what do you want?
War.
You want war? Yeah.
Yeah, they want war.
But on the other hand, taking a more abstract view of it, as socialists, where do we stand on friendship and enmity between existing governments, which are, after all, evil anyway? It's like I don't know which to choose between. When they make friends with each other, then they can accomplish some pretty awful things.
Well, I mean, on the question of the Koreas, we have to remember the kind of war the U.S. fought in North Korea. I mean, and the reason why there is no end of the Korean War is not because of North Korea, unlike the image in the press. It's because South Korea and the United States refused. I mean, this is one of the demands, by the way, of the crazy despot of North Korea. He's demanding that why don't we end the state of war? Why don't we declare an end to the Korean War? And the way that the United States fought that war, 20% of the population were killed. I mean, they basically, when they ran out of things to bomb, they started bombing like whatever is buildings and so on. So there is a fresh horrific memories for people in Korea about the United States and its war. So the fear in North Korea of the US is not crazy. It is crazy how the media disregard North Korean fears of the United States, especially when US troops, 28,000 of them are stationed along the border and with nuclear weapons within reach against North Korea.
60 years.
Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah.
Here's a mic. One thing that hasn't been spoken about today is oil. How does oil underlie all of these deliberations you're talking about?
Well, I mean, Trump, one of the things about Trump is that, to me, he seems to be the best expert of oil-rich Arab Gulf governments that we've had in the Oval Office in history. He knows how to deal with them. I mean, without any slogans, without any diplomatic discourse, he bluntly tells them, lower the price of oil, produce more oil, compensate for loss of Iranian oil in the market. They do. They comply. That's what, oil is extremely huge on the US agenda in the Middle East. People say, like, we don't import as much oil from the Gulf anymore. Of course we don't. US now is a huge producer of oil. Now there is shale extraction and so on. And much of the oil that we used to import in the last 20 years is not from the Middle East, in fact. It's from Canada and from Venezuela, of all places. So it's not about oil, it's about the prices of oil. That's what's important for political and economic reasons of presidents and Congress of the United States. And the Saudis have been extremely compliant over the years. You know how the Iranian student took the embassy in Iran in 1979, and the Americans at that time shredded all these documents, right? And you know how the Iranian government at the time invited all people who majored in English at Iranian universities to volunteer and to assemble the shredded documents. You know, shredders in the past, so I think the new invention, the production, the new type of shredders learned from what happened in Iran. It's not like, there used to be neat rows that would be cut like that. So Iranian student went and assembled them like jigsaw puzzles, and they published them in 100 volumes. We have them, by the way, at UC Berkeley Library. One of the few places they have them. So I read through them over the years, and one of the things that struck me in answer to your question is how much oil, especially in the 1960s and 70s, how much oil was on the agenda and discussions. Every meeting in the Middle East, there was the issue of oil, because it's about the pricing of oil in the world. And that's why it's important for the United States. So the United States want, and Trump says this publicly, the United States not only wants America to dictate the price of oil, even if it's not beneficial to the economies of the people there, but the United States wants the revenue of oil to be recycled back in the United States. But they have been doing that all along. They buy so much of weapons that they don't need, and they also put their money in US banks. We want more of that. That's what Trump is negotiating. He wants more than that. But I doubt he's going to get much more. I don't think Saudi pledges are going to be matched.
Thank you. The question of oil actually kind of ties into my question. And one thing I really liked about what you had to say was kind of, whatever Trump may have said on the campaign trail, as soon as he gets into office, you immediately see kind of his policy subordinate to kind of what the foreign policy and military apparatus want. And you kind of discussed about how you've seen that process even intensify, where you think back maybe in the 60s and 70s where you had presidents maybe firing generals they disagree with, but now there's much more of a trend where the president is kind of needing to toe the line, and that's what you've witnessed. I was wondering if you could speak more about kind of the economic and political forces behind the scene that you feel have intensified that process.
I'm not really well qualified to speak about the economic matters of the state. But I think what is happening is that, we speak, in the political science literature, they speak about the imperial presidency, that the president can do so much in terms of foreign policy. And it's true, like compared to the domestic policy president, the foreign policy president is much stronger. And he is much more difficult to tame. In 1973, the Congress came out with the War Powers Act, by which a US president cannot deploy troops overseas for more than 60 days, beyond which he or she requires the consent of Congress. But since 1973, how empty has been that law? How did it affect? And the answer is because of political cowardice. The reason why Congress squandered its own constitutional prerogatives is because they are afraid of their own voters. Because members of Congress do not want to be seen as people who voted against war, because that is translated in political language. They stood against our troops. They abandoned our troops in battle. And of course, that haunted John Kerry, who voted for the troops and against the troops in the accusation by the Bush campaign at the time. But certainly, what I am seeing in the state today, however, and this is something that we should go back to read some of the stuff that came out from Edward Snowden's contribution to our understanding of the modern state. Edward Snowden, it's not that he leaked information. Edward Snowden gave us an understanding of the modern American state that we did not know before. Look at the American media still talking about the East German secret police. I mean, East German secret police had no reach comparable to the NSA, for example. This is a global reach. This is Orwellian by any dimension. And what we are seeing today, like the Washington Post and New York Times in particular, they have become unofficial arms of the intelligence services of the United States. And and this is what the president is facing. I mean, Trump made a mistake early on by criticizing, mocking the intelligence services. And I think because he is so lazy, he's so not well read, he was unaware how powerful these entities are. And those entities have been going after him, and they are not going to let go. And they get their way. On most issues, they have been getting their ways. The only time when he went against them, basically, was with the Iran nuclear deal. The military intelligence apparatus wanted to keep that deal in, and he wanted against it. And he got his way. But on all other issues you can think of, he's going along with them. Because the presidency molds you. You don't mold it on foreign policy and war, especially in the age of the war presidency, which has been in continuation since the 1980s. And this is what is ironic to me, because I came to the US in '83, and with the end of the Cold War, we used to speak about a peace dividend. Peace dividend. That America, there's no Cold War, that the money that used to be used for the military is going to be diverted for peaceful purposes. If anything, the war apparatus has expanded exponentially. The budget of defense, look at it this year, over $700 billion. That's not counting the intelligence budget, which is what, over $60, $70 billion? Add to that. This is the state we live in when there's no Cold War. We want war. The United States needs war to justify this empire. Yes, please.
First, thank you. This has all been very interesting. This is just a very small point, but I was interested in what you said about Khashoggi, that given that neither of the major parties has any intention of changing the relationship with Saudi Arabia, and all this attention to this, I can see that the Washington Post, for instance, is interested in embarrassing Trump, that nothing's really going to happen, but they're going to embarrass Trump. Is it possible that one of the princes that Khashoggi supported is also interested in embarrassing the Crown Prince?
Well, no.
Okay.
The Crown Prince today in Saudi Arabia pretty much rules supreme. Mm-hmm. He defanged all rival princes. Most of them are under house arrest. His own half-brothers, who are more qualified for government, knows more about government than he does, have been under house arrest. So this guy has arrested so many people. He reminds me of Sadat in his last year. So no, he is not threatened anymore. He rules over the royal family. What is happening, however, is I feel that the US government, the Turkish government, and the Saudi government are trying to work out a cover-up deal by which they find a scapegoat, maybe the chief of the Saudi council, they will blame him, and all will go back to normal. That's what Trump would like, I think. However, there is an obstacle to that. In the Turkish government, there is clearly a wing that doesn't want a cover-up, does not want a cover-up. These are the ones. If you compare the Turkish press that has been receiving leaks from the intelligence of Turkey, it is very different tune than Erdogan, who has been very quiet and very restrained, unlike his rhetoric in the past. He's been very restrained, and I think he's making a political calculation. He can extract an exorbitant price from the Saudi government. Similarly, Trump can also extract an exorbitant price. So this Crown Prince may stay in power, but he won't be the same. His best days are behind him. If he stays in power, he'll be much weaker than he ever was before he even arrived to the throne. So this is why it's a very bad time for him, and he is obligated to make a compromise of sort that is against his own interest and his own image as a firm leader who doesn't compromise. And I was happy today that there were more leakage in Turkish press. They leaked a picture of a guy in a medical outfit coming into the residence of the ambassador, the chief of the consul in Istanbul and so on. So they clearly don't want a deal. They're trying to sabotage it. And Erdogan's statement today were a little bit, and the foreign minister, less restrained than they were. There was one in the back.
Hey, I was hoping you could say a few words on the level of tension between Russia and the U.S. and Syria.
Well, I don't know. I feel that the United States and the Russians have been able to maintain their interventions in Syria with very little friction. They basically have a spheres of influence whereby the Americans rule over the Kurdish area and the Russians have great sway. They don't have full control because they are competing with allies that are not fully trusting of them, like the Iranians. But they have an accommodation of sort, just as Russia has had an accommodation with the occupation state of Israel. I mean, so the Russian government is willing to protect the Syrian regime, but is not willing to antagonize the Israeli occupation state. Remember that if any of you harbor illusions about the role of Russia in Syria or elsewhere. I mean, if I did not trust the Soviet Union in the past in the Middle East, which I didn't, when I was a hardcore Marxist-Leninist, I certainly do not trust Putin today, who is the farthest thing from socialism or Marxism. And remember that the summit between Trump and Putin, Trump commented later that there was ample time used during their meeting with Putin showering praise on Netanyahu. Putin is a great fan of Netanyahu. Last question.
I'd be interested in, there's the mic. Hey, Mike. A little more on the question of Palestine. One being the importance of that question for the peoples of the Middle East, your assessment of that. And secondly, of the peoples of the Middle East, for the support for the Palestinian people, because obviously for years and years, decades, it's been central. The second question, just about your assessment of the situation of the Palestinians. Obviously, there's still a deep hatred. I mean, there's no way that people can accept their condition, but the encroachment of these settler camps that are chopping everything up, the political divisions that exist there, I'll leave it at that because I don't want to frame the whole thing. But it's something that I wouldn't say it's an anathema, but it's a little difficult for me to put my finger on now.
Well, I think that you have to evaluate the role or the centrality of the Palestinian question in the Middle East region with an eye on the duality between the people of the region, how they feel about Palestine, and between governments that they suffer under who are in the pocket of Israel and the United States. So their feeling and sentiments are in contrast with the agenda of the government under which they live. But the centrality of Palestine by the people hasn't changed. Notice whenever people have freedom to express themselves as they did in Egypt for a brief period, or in Tunisia, they are very vocal on the centrality of Palestine, or in Lebanon, for example. But I worry about something else, which is that in the past, like nothing substitute street activisms. Like in the past, when Palestinians are being killed in Lebanon and elsewhere, people would take to the streets and demonstrate, go to embassies, US embassies, and so on. I feel that in the age of social media, people do much less of that because they express themselves on social media. I just wrote this morning, because I was thinking just yesterday, 2 Palestinians were killed and 170 were injured. And there was nothing about that. And I wrote in Arabic and English that if opium is the religion of the people, social media are the crack of the people today. I mean, people feel that they express themselves, they have sentiments, they pass pictures, they put a like here or there, and we've done it. But that does not change things, does not affect policies, like demonstrating, protesting outside of an embassy. I mean, the Egyptian youth, for example, many of them are Marxist. These were largely communists of different type. The people of Egypt, when they protested outside the Israeli embassy and set it on fire, that's when Egypt had freedom of expression. And as you remember, the Obama administration contacted the Egyptian chief of staff and threatened them that if you do not save the Israeli diplomat and Mossad agent that are inside, there will be a cutoff of US aid to Egyptian military corruption. And that's what they did. The Egyptian military sent people dressed as regular Egyptian. They snuck them into the embassy while the protest was going on, and they smuggled these Mossad agent, assassin, whatever they were doing inside the embassy, and they smuggled them outside of the country on a private jet. We are talking about people having no freedom to express themselves given the regimes that America have imposed down their necks. Thank you all for coming and for listening.